A racist woman calls the cops on a young homeless black boy, accusing him of being a threat. But when the police arrive, what they uncover will expose more than just prejudice. It will change lives forever. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across Maplewood, a serene suburban neighborhood where every lawn was meticulously trimmed and every driveway was home to polished cars. To the residents, it was a haven of safety and order. But on this day, an incident was brewing that would shake this community to its core. As she peered out of her large bay window, Mrs. Margaret Caldwell, a woman known for her pristine garden and sharp tongue, spotted movement across the street. There, standing near the corner of the park, was a boy. His clothes were tattered, his shoes barely held together, and a worn backpack hung limply from his shoulders. He couldn't have been older than 12, but to Margaret, he was an unwelcome sight. Her pulse quickened. "What's he doing here?" she thought, her brow furrowing. To her, this was no place for someone like him, a young black boy who clearly didn't belong. She grabbed her phone, her hand trembling not with fear, but with indignation. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, there's a suspicious individual in my neighborhood, she began, her voice clipped and urgent. He looks out of place. I think he might be a danger to the community. The dispatcher's tone remained calm, but there was a pause. Ma'am, can you describe the individual? Margaret glanced outside again, taking in the boy's thin frame. He wasn't doing anything but standing there, looking at the park sign as if trying to read it. He's young, maybe 12 or 13. He's black, wearing dirty clothes, and he's just loitering. The dispatcher's voice softened. Ma'am, is the individual doing anything threatening? Margaret hesitated, glancing back out the window. Threatening. Number. But the sight of him made her uncomfortable, and that was enough. He doesn't belong here. Please send someone quickly. Meanwhile, outside on the corner, Deshawn Parker pulled the straps of his backpack tighter. The sun was setting, and with it, the temperature dropped. He'd been wandering for hours, his stomach growling louder with every step. His mother always told him to be strong, but it was hard to remember her words when the emptiness in his belly felt like it was swallowing him whole. Deshawn looked at the park sign, trying to decipher the map etched into it. It showed where benches, water fountains, and public restrooms were located. He wondered if he could rest there for a while, just until he figured out his next move. He had been on his own for 2 days now, ever since he'd been kicked out of the shelter downtown for overstaying his time. He sat on the curb, pulling a crumpled photo from his pocket. It was of him and his mother, both smiling widely in front of a birthday cake. That was before everything fell apart, before the eviction, before the shelter, and before she'd sent him out that night to stay with a neighbor who eventually turned him away. His lips trembled as he whispered, "I miss you, Mom." The sudden screech of tires broke his thoughts. He looked up to see a police car pulling up to the curb, its lights flashing, though the siren remained off. Deshawn's heart sank. Inside the car, Officer Harris glanced at his partner, Officer Miller. Harris, a seasoned officer nearing retirement, wore a weary expression. Miller, fresh out of the academy, was full of nervous energy. Dispatch said it's a loitering call, Harris muttered, rubbing his temple. A young black kid in a nice neighborhood. Wonder what that's about. His tone was laced with sarcasm, but Miller didn't catch it. Let's check it out, Miller said, reaching for the door handle. As the officers approached Deshawn, he stood up, clutching his backpack tightly. His instincts screamed to run, but his legs felt like lead. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how situations like this could spiral out of control. Hey, son, Harris called out, his voice firm but not unkind. Mind telling us what you're doing here? Deshawn swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. I was just resting, sir. Miller's eyes darted to Deshawn's backpack. What's in the bag? Deshawn hesitated, then unzipped it slowly, revealing nothing more than a thin blanket, an apple core, and a few crumpled pieces of paper. Harris's gaze softened as he looked at the meager belongings. Miller, however, looked back toward the house from which the call had come. Margaret stood there, watching through her curtains. "Someone called about you," Miller said, his tone edging on suspicion. "Said you looked like you didn't belong." Deshawn's throat tightened. "I wasn't doing anything wrong, I promise." Harris looked back at Margaret's house, then at the boy standing before him. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He took a deep breath, his voice calm but probing. "Where are you coming from, kid? And where are you going?" Deshawn hesitated, unsure whether to tell the truth. He didn't want pity, or worse, to be taken away. His fingers clutched the strap of his bag tightly as he glanced at the officers, his voice trembling. I don't have anywhere to go." The air grew heavy, the flashing lights illuminating the boy's fearful eyes. Harris turned toward his partner, his expression unreadable. "What's the plan?" Miller asked, already reaching for his radio. Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at Deshawn, the weight of the moment settling on him like a lead blanket. Unbeknownst to them all, what was about to unfold would uncover far more than anyone could have imagined. The tension hung thick in the air as Officer Harris studied Deshawn. His hands rested on his hips, the faintest sigh escaping his lips. He'd been on the force long enough to recognize the fragility of moments like these, how quickly things could escalate. Yet, in the boy's trembling frame and hollow eyes, Harris saw not a threat, but a child teetering on the edge of despair. "Kid," Harris said gently, lowering his tone, "why don't you tell us the full story? What's got you out here all alone?" Deshawn hesitated. His instincts screamed not to trust anyone in a uniform, but Harris's voice didn't carry the sharpness he was used to. Finally he spoke, his words uneven. I got nowhere else to go. My mom, she's gone. I've been walking, trying to find somewhere to stay." Harris nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, while Miller's jaw tightened. "So, you're saying you're homeless?" Miller asked bluntly, his voice carrying a trace of skepticism. Deshawn's cheeks burned as he looked down at his worn sneakers. He hated the word, hated how it made him feel invisible and exposed at the same time. "Yeah," he murmured. "I guess I am." From her window, Margaret watched the scene unfold, her expression one of triumph. She had called the police to restore order, and to her, this was justice in action. She turned away briefly, satisfied, but not before catching Harris's gaze as he glanced up at her window. Something in his look made her shift uneasily. Harris crouched slightly to meet Deshawn's gaze. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now. "We're not here to give you a hard time. But I need you to understand something. People around here don't react well to what they don't recognize." He glanced briefly at Miller, whose face remained stoic, before continuing. "That's not your fault, okay? But we've got to figure out what to do next." Deshawn's stomach twisted. "I'm not in trouble, am I?" "No," Harris said firmly. "You're not. But I do need to ask, do you have anyone we can call? A relative? A family friend?" Deshawn shook his head, his voice cracking. "No one. It's just me." Miller exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. "Harris, what's the play here? We can't just leave him on the street." "I know that," Harris said, standing upright and giving Miller a look that silenced further argument. "Let's take it one step at a time." Harris reached for his radio but paused. He glanced back at Margaret's house and then at Deshawn. He had seen this play out too many times before. Assumptions leading to accusations, accusations leading to harm. His gut told him that there was more to this than just a concerned citizen's call. Back inside her house, Margaret paced the living room. The sight of Harris talking to the boy, sympathizing with him it seemed, made her blood boil. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The boy was supposed to be taken away, out of her neighborhood. She had worked hard to live in a place like this, and she wasn't about to let someone like him ruin it. She stepped onto her porch, waving her arms to get the officer's attention. "Officers," she called, her voice sharp. "I don't know why this is taking so long, but I'd like to know what's being done. He's been loitering here for hours." Harris and Miller exchanged a glance. Miller's expression darkened, but Harris gave a subtle shake of his head. He turned to Margaret, walking toward her with measured steps. "Ma'am," he began, keeping his tone professional. "The boy hasn't done anything illegal. He's just resting." "Resting?" Margaret repeated incredulously, her voice rising. "Do you know how many break-ins we've had in this area? How do you know he's not casing the neighborhood?" Harris narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, we've checked his belongings, and there's nothing suspicious. He's just a kid." Margaret crossed her arms, her lips pursed tightly. "If something happens to this neighborhood because you didn't act, that's on you." Harris took a deep breath, his patience wearing thin. "I'll make sure nothing happens, ma'am," he said evenly before turning away. Back by the curb, Deshawn sat silently, watching the exchange. Harris returned, kneeling slightly to meet his eyes again. "You okay?" he asked. Deshawn nodded faintly, though his shoulders remained tense. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked if he was okay. "Here's what we're going to do," Harris continued. "I know a place where you can stay tonight, a shelter nearby. It's not perfect, but it's safe, and tomorrow, we'll figure out a longer-term solution. Does that sound all right?" Deshawn's eyes welled with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. "Yeah, thank you." As Harris helped Deshawn to his feet, Miller's radio crackled with an update from dispatch. Additional information on the call at Maplewood. Caller identified the subject as a possible threat due to appearance. No further details provided. Miller glanced at Harris, then at Margaret's house. He muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Harris, now more resolved than ever, guided Deshawn toward the squad car. "You're not the problem here, kid," he said softly. "Remember that." But as they prepared to leave, Margaret stepped onto her porch again, her phone in hand. She raised it toward them, recording. "Just so you know," she called out, "I'll be documenting this. When this turns into a problem, don't say I didn't warn you." Harris stared at her for a long moment before helping Deshawn into the car. He didn't respond to Margaret's words, but his jaw clenched tightly. He knew there was more to this story, and something told him it wouldn't end here. The hum of the police car's engine filled the silence as Officer Harris drove through the dimly lit streets, Deshawn sitting quietly in the back seat. His hands fidgeted with the straps of his backpack, his mind replaying the events of the past hour. The flashing lights, Margaret's accusations, and the overwhelming fear of not knowing what might happen next. It was all too much. Harris glanced at Deshawn in the rearview mirror. "You holding up okay back there?" he asked. Deshawn nodded hesitantly but didn't speak. His gaze was fixed on the photo he'd pulled from his pocket again, the one of him and his mom. Harris caught sight of it and softened his tone. "Is that your mom?" Deshawn finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah. This is from my birthday last year. She worked 3 jobs just to get me that cake." He traced his finger along the edges of the photo. But then, everything fell apart. She got sick, and we lost everything. Harris felt a pang of guilt in his chest. He'd seen countless cases like this, but it never got easier. "I'm sorry, kid. You've been through more than anyone should have to." Deshawn's lip quivered, but he quickly wiped his face. "I just want to make her proud, you know. She told me to stay strong, no matter what." Harris tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The boy's resilience was striking, but so was the pain he carried. Meanwhile, Officer Miller had returned to the precinct to file his report on the incident. Sitting at his desk, he couldn't shake the image of Margaret standing on her porch, her phone raised like a weapon. The more he thought about it, the more it infuriated him. The boy had done nothing wrong, yet she had treated him like a criminal simply for existing in her neighborhood. Miller began typing out the details of the call, But something compelled him to dig deeper. He pulled up the incident report database and searched Margaret's name. A few moments later, a list of complaints appeared on his screen. Noise complaints, accusations of loitering, and even a few police reports where she'd claimed people were acting suspiciously near her property. In nearly every case, the individuals she reported were Black or Latino. Figures, Miller muttered under his breath. He flagged the reports and added them to Harris's case notes. He wasn't sure where this was going yet, but he knew something wasn't right. Harris pulled up to the community shelter, a modest brick building with a faded sign that read, Hope Haven. The warm glow of light spilling from the windows offered a small sense of comfort. Harris stepped out of the car and opened the door for Deshawn. "Come on, kid," he said, motioning for Deshawn to follow him inside. The receptionist, a kind woman in her 50s named Marla, greeted them with a tired but welcoming smile. "Evening, Officer Harris," she said. "What can I do for you?" "This is Deshawn," Harris explained, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He needs a place to stay for the night." Marla's expression softened as she leaned down to meet Deshawn's eyes. "Well, you've come to the right place, sweetheart. Let's get you settled." As Marla led Deshawn to a small cot in the back, Harris lingered in the lobby, watching them disappear down the hall. There was a heaviness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He'd done his part for the night, but something about the situation felt incomplete. Moments later, Marla returned. "You've got a good heart, Harris," she said quietly. "But that boy's been through more than most adults could handle. What's going to happen to him?" Harris sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." The next morning, Harris sat at his desk, poring over Miller's notes. As he read through the reports on Margaret's history of complaints, a pattern began to emerge. She wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She had a track record of targeting people who didn't fit her idea of who belonged. Harris couldn't ignore the glaring prejudice in her actions. He decided to dig further, pulling up surveillance footage from the neighborhood's traffic cameras. After an hour of searching, he found what he was looking for, a clip showing Deshawn walking down the street, pausing to read the park map, and sitting quietly on the curb. There was no sign of loitering, no suspicious behavior, and certainly no reason for Margaret to call the police. Harris leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He'd always known prejudice existed in their community, but seeing it laid out so clearly ignited a fire within him. It wasn't enough to help Deshawn for one night. He had to address the larger issue. He picked up his phone and dialed Miller. "I need you to meet me at the station," he said. "We've got work to do." As the officers prepared their case, Margaret went about her day as if nothing had happened. She proudly shared the story of her heroic 911 call with her neighbors, spinning a narrative that painted her as a protector of the community. But she had no idea that her actions were now under scrutiny. What Harris and Miller uncovered that morning would set the stage for a confrontation that would leave everyone in Maplewood questioning their own assumptions and expose truths Margaret could no longer deny. The morning sun shone brightly over Maplewood, but the warmth of the day did little to mask the unease brewing within the community. Word of the previous night's events had begun to spread, and with it came whispers, speculations, and sharply divided opinions. Margaret, as vocal as ever, had already taken to social media, posting a long rant about how she protected the neighborhood from a dangerous vagrant. "People like him don't belong here," she typed furiously on her phone. "The police might not act, but I won't let Maplewood become unsafe for my family." Her post garnered support from a handful of like-minded residents, but it also ignited backlash. Comments poured in, challenging her narrative. "He's just a kid. Did you even stop to ask why he was there? Calling the cops on a homeless child? That's what's unsafe. Margaret, this isn't about safety. This is about your prejudice." Margaret, however, doubled down, convinced that her actions were justified. She basked in the validation from her supporters, ignoring the growing tide of criticism. At the station, Harris and Miller were hard at work compiling their findings. The evidence was damning. Margaret's history of racially charged complaints, surveillance footage showing Deshawn doing nothing but sitting quietly, and a community increasingly fed up with her behavior. "This isn't just about the boy," Miller said, his frustration evident. "It's about how people like Margaret weaponize the police against anyone they see as other." Harris nodded. "Exactly. It's a pattern, one that needs to stop." But Harris wasn't just focused on holding Margaret accountable. He also wanted to ensure Deshawn had the support he needed. The boy's story haunted him, and he knew a single night at the shelter wasn't enough. He picked up his phone and made a call to Marla at Hope Haven. "Marla," Harris began, "we need to do more for this kid. Do you know of any long-term options for him?" Marla sighed. "It's tough, Harris. Resources are stretched thin. But let me make some calls. That boy's got a spark. I don't want to see it snuffed out." By midday, Margaret was fuming. She had expected the community to rally behind her, but instead, she found herself under scrutiny. Neighbors she'd once considered allies avoided her gaze, and the comments on her post continued to pour in, many questioning her motives. Her unease grew when she spotted a police car pulling up in front of her house. Harris and Miller stepped out, their expressions calm but resolute. Margaret straightened her posture, forcing a smile as she opened the door. "Officers," she said, feigning politeness. "What can I do for you?" Harris cleared his throat. "Mrs. Caldwell, we're here to follow up on last night's call. There are some things we need to discuss." Margaret's smile faltered. "Discuss? I already told you everything. That boy was loitering. He didn't belong here." Harris exchanged a glance with Miller before stepping forward. "Mrs. Caldwell, we've reviewed the surveillance footage and your history of complaints. It's clear that your actions last night were based on assumptions, not facts. Deshawn wasn't doing anything wrong. He's a child, alone and struggling, and he deserved compassion, not suspicion." Margaret's face reddened. "Are you accusing me of something? I was just protecting my neighborhood." Miller spoke up, his tone firm. "Mrs. Caldwell, weaponizing the police against someone based on their appearance isn't protecting anyone. It's harmful and dangerous. This community deserves better." The conversation left Margaret reeling. She'd never been confronted so directly before, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. As the officers left, she stood in her doorway, staring after them. The truth was hard to ignore, no matter how much she wanted to. Later that day, Harris attended a community meeting at the local recreation center. The room buzzed with energy as residents gathered to discuss what had happened. Many were angry, demanding change. A young black woman stood and addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about Margaret," she said, her voice strong. "It's about all of us. We've let this happen in our neighborhood for too long. It's time we stand up, not just for Deshawn, but for anyone who's been treated like they don't belong." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Harris felt a swell of hope. The incident with Deshawn had brought long-buried tensions to the surface, but it had also ignited a conversation the community desperately needed. Back at the shelter, Deshawn sat on his cot, staring at the photo of his mom. He missed her fiercely, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Marla entered the room, her face lit with a smile. "Hey there," she said. "I've got some good news. We found a program that can help you, somewhere safe, with people who care." Deshawn looked up, his eyes wide. "Really? Really?" Marla said, sitting beside him. "And Harris called. He wants to check in on you tomorrow. You've got people rooting for you, kiddo." Deshawn's lip trembled, but he smiled. "Thank you," he whispered. As the sun set over Maplewood, the pieces of a larger story were coming together. Deshawn's life wasn't perfect, but he wasn't alone anymore. And the community, fractured as it was, had a chance to rebuild itself into something stronger and more just.